Before I start speaking about this topic, our conference, I would like to say a few words about Denmark. I love this country, I love these people, and I have bad and very good experience in Denmark. In 2002, I've been put in prison by a Russian request, accusing a lady as a terrorist. After that, in a few weeks, I was released, and Danish people and Danish government, they did everything to help Chechens. At that time, it was very support for Chechnya, which we have fighting against Russian aggression. And that time, Danish judge and Danish government released me and said it was a political motivated prosecution. It was very supportive. And thank you again. Thank you very much, people. Thank you. And of course, also I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me in this very important panel. The topic of our discussion is formulated with the two most procedure beyond anti-war responsibility and de-Imperialisation. And this module contains the essential point. It is not enough to simply be against the war. It is not enough to be condemn individual crimes. It is not enough to speak about peace if the source of the war is not addressed. Because the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine is not an accident and not a mistake, not a deviation from the norm. It is a logical continuation of the imperial nature of the Russian state. This is why today we must speak not only about ending the war, but also about political, historical, and moral responsibility, about decolonization, about de-imperialization, about the need to reconsider the very approach to Russia, not as a natural and indivisible state, but as a space built on conquest, violence, and the suppression of the other peoples. For the Chechen people, this is not theory. It is our historical experience. We know all too well what Russian imperialism is. We know how it arrives under the slogans of order, law, fighting terrorism, and protesting the state. But behind these words, there is always the same reality: depriving people of their rights to speak their language, to live within their own political tradition, to determine their own future, and ultimately simply to be themselves. Chechnya experienced this long before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that is why, from the very beginning, we said, if the empire is not stopped in Chechnya, it will move further. If the world agrees to treat colonial violence as an internal matter of Russian Federation, that violence will inevitably extend beyond its formal borders. And that is exactly what happened now in Ukraine. Today, Ukraine is paying not enormous price. Ukraine is paying an enormous price not only for its freedom, but also for the strategic mistake of the West, which for too long received Russia as an inevitably historical constant. For too long, Russia was studied as a great culture, a complex civilization, a necessary partner, a difficult but important neighbor, and far too was it viewed as an empire, as a state whose existence in its current form is based on the subjugation of non-Russian peoples, the erasure of their memory, the appropriation of their territories, the exploitation of their resources, and the mobilization of their sons for criminal wars. And here, I want to be especially clear: the anti-war position in itself does not yet mean a break with the empire. One can oppose a particular war and still remain captive to imperial thinking. One can say we are against Putin while continue to believe that after Putin, Russia should remain the same centralized, indivisible, and dominate over subjected peoples. One can oppose the bombing of Kyiv and Kharkov, yet not recognize the right to Chechen, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, the peoples of the North Caucasus and other subjected peoples to political agency. One can call one's democratic opposition while fearing even the word decolonization. But in that case, this is not a democratic alternative to empire. It is an attempt to save the empire in a more acceptable form. Today, Europe must understand a simple truth. The problem is not limited to Putin. Putin is not an exception. He is a product of Russian imperial matrix. And if that matrix is preserved, new forms of aggression will inevitably emerge again under different names, under different slogans, perhaps even more liberal and palatable to the outside world. Therefore, the question of responsibility today concerns not only Russia elites, it also concerns international political thinking. Europe must stop fearing the collapse of the empire more than it fears its crimes. For many years, Western policy was based on the false assumption that preserving Russia within its current borders was a condition for stability. But reality has shown the opposite. The source of instability is not the collapse of empire. The source of instability is the preservation of empire. Stability is impossible where millions of people are deprived of voice, where entire nations are reduced to ethnographic appendage of a center, where feudalism exists only on paper, where any aspiration of freedom is labeled extremism, where the memory of colonial violence is silenced, and the empire continues to present itself as a bearer of a civilizing mission. That is why the de-imperialization of Russia is not radical fantasy. It is a necessary condition for long-term security in Europe. What does it mean in particular terms? First and foremost, it means recognize the agency of subjugated peoples, not in a symbolic or folklore sense, but in a political one. It means that world must begin to listen not only to representatives of the so-called Russian opposition, but also to voices of those people who have historically been objects of Russian colonial rule. It means supporting not just anti-war initiatives, but the imperial movements, thus forces that are ready to say honestly, Russia must renounce its imperial legacy, acknowledge colonial crimes, renounce the imperial legacy, acknowledge colonial crimes, abandon the practice of forcibly holding peoples, and open the path to genuine self-determination. It also requires intellectual honesty. One cannot seriously speak about a new architecture of European security while maintaining on an old colonial lens. One cannot support the freedom of Ukraine while ignoring the freedom of Chechnya or other subjugated peoples. One cannot fight the consequences of empire while being afraid to call the empire by its name. For us Chechens, the question of responsibility is not abstract. We have paid for it with tens of thousands of lives, destroyed cities, and generations raised amid war, exile, and repression. But precisely for that reason, we have the right to say what perhaps not everyone is yet ready to say aloud. The world after this war cannot build on a return to the old illusion of a normal Russia. There is no way back. What is needed in new thinking, a new political ethics, a new map of responsibility which show us You're right. And on that map, everyone must be named aggressor, accomplices, silent beneficiaries, and those who for too long preserve convenient forms over truth. But there must also be those who resisted Ukraine. They are Chechen people, other objected peoples, all those who, despite the cost, continue to affirm that freedom is not an exercise to geopolitics, but a fundamental principle of international order. Today, Ukraine, it is defending not only itself, it is dismantling the many myths of the invisible empire. It is restoring political reality to Europe. It is forcing us to rethink the language with which we describe security responsibility and the future of the continent. And that is why the conversation about the decolonization of Russia is not about the past, it is about the future of Europe.